Everyone for coming. Little background on myself. I am newer to the society of less than a year, about a year. I'm actually newer to Traverse City too, November of 2019. I also belong to Western Wayne County Genealogical Society downstate, and I've been with them for 9 years or so, and I've sat on that board as secretary for 3.5 years till I retired up here. I've been researching my ancestors and other people also, others ancestors, since 1990-ish on and off, steadily since 2014. And since I retired, got plenty of time now. I'm very excited to work with the dedicated people on the board and in the leadership positions. I'm going to introduce very quickly the board to you. I'm the president. Our acting vice president could not be here, but she's joining us by Zoom. That's Anna, and she is research chairperson and cemetery chairperson. In the back, Sue Leach is the treasurer, membership chair, newsletter, and publicity. Our secretary, Rita, is not here. John Moody, our webmaster, and Olson's receipts coordinator. Acquisitions, Kathleen Farley, and historian Ginny LeClaire. As you can see, many of them wear multiple hats. So I feel pretty fortunate to have a great team to work with. I do want to thank Linda Forwork, our past president, for her work, and she stepped in a rough time. About the Olson receipts. It turns out this is a significant addition to the society monetarily, besides just the dues that are collected. So when John took over, Olson's had donated $2,373 to our society. He's made 4 submissions totaling $309, and we're not even halfway through the year. He reminded me, if you think about it, $309 is the equivalent of 15 memberships, dues memberships. So that's significant. So we're asking anyone that shops at Olson's or knows anybody that does, please donate those receipts to us, and John takes care of the whole thing. I'm going to introduce our speaker now. Linda Alice Dewey is the chairman of the Glen Arbor Township Cemetery Advisory Board. After retiring from teaching, Linda subbed at Glen Lake School from 2014 until the pandemic. Linda is an award-winning artist and writer, author of 2 books and numerous articles for local papers. She is a professional artist and art teacher specializing in pastels. Linda's current project is a book about her father's experience in World War II as a bomber pilot in the Castle Mission Air Battle. Linda is the president of Castle Mission Historical Society, championing the search for 8 MIAs from the mission, 2 of which have been positively identified over the past year. Another 5 have been exhumed and are going through the identification process, and 1 more remaining in Germany, working to get him identified and returned home. Please welcome Linda.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. Genealogically, my family is very interested in research, and so my background kind of wove into all of this historical research that has occurred. It's almost like I was prepared, and something very interesting that happened was one day I was walking to the cemetery to check on something, and Anna was coming out, and in a vehicle, and we hadn't had time to put up signs or anything yet that no vehicles. Now you can't do it because now there are big logs in there. But she was coming out, and I was walking in, and it was the timing was pretty amazing. She could not have gotten into the cemetery without some kind of help. And we can arrange for track chairs through the national park, and I'll get into all of that. But it was very interesting, the timing of that, how, and with my position, I was able to answer so many questions for her. It was just made it so easy for this connection to happen. So it was like it was meant to be. So and my interest in the cemetery goes back. The first time I visited was in the early 1990s. It was a very small cemetery in the middle of the woods. Have any of you been to this cemetery yet? So had you been there before the clearing, before the work? So you know what it was like. It was a very small. Have you been there since the clearing? It's just amazing what's happened. Some of us really liked the old cemetery, little cemetery in the woods surrounded by trees, and now it's this big expanse filled with graves that we couldn't see before. It's just so phenomenal. So it's a very inspiring story. I first went there in 1991. I had an experience, a spiritual experience there that hooked me for life. And I always was going back. And then when the storm of 2017 came, or 2015 came, that really demolished Glen Arbor for a while. I have a little 50-foot lot. I'm fortunate enough to be able to have, I lost 30 trees, sorry. I lost 30 trees on a 50-foot lot. It was really something. So the cemetery became, the passage was impassable. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. So this is a really quite inspiring, amazing story that I'm going to share with you. The cemetery was nearly abandoned. They couldn't get to it. And it was deactivated in 1927. All of the original maps and records had been lost. We had nothing. Over the years, it became overgrown until only the central area was approachable, where there were 13 marked headstones. Otherwise, there was no indication that there were any graves anywhere else. And then the cemetery was sold by mistake. And I'll explain how that happened. Finally, it was buried by the storm of 2015 and became totally inaccessible. So here's the thing. There are a lot of cemeteries that could really use help. And for the township, we needed to find out what were we legally obligated to do, and what, where was our obligation? Where was our responsibility as a township? And I felt it myself. I was telling my son this morning that I remember exactly the moment when I had written a couple of books about things that happened stemming from my experience at the cemetery. And every time I would go by the road that was leading to the cemetery, I would look that way and I would go, oh, what's going to happen? And when I finally realized that it wasn't going to happen unless I did something. I know a lot of people loved that cemetery and still do. But for some reason I felt it upon myself. I know that some of you have felt this kind of thing. So the thing is that you all live in townships. Every township is required by the state to have its own cemetery. And the question is, what kind of shape is the township cemetery in? What kind of, how does it look? What are the possibilities? And what kind of secrets, besides what we can't see below the ground, what is the history that is lying there in that cemetery waiting to be discovered? What are the stories there that could be learned? And that was the pull for me. And that's why I got involved. So let's start with some known facts. Let's see, I have this lovely gadget here. There we go. So the Glen Arbor Cemetery measures 175 by 264 feet. It is approximately 1 acre. There are 13 headstones. It was the township cemetery for 48 years. During that time, Glen Arbor's population fluctuated between 350 to 550 residents. I think right now, including people who have marked Glen Arbor as their primary residence, that doesn't mean they're there year round. We have I think about 625, maybe something like that. So it was close to that at sometimes. And of course, that's because of the logging industry. So the first two graves at the Glen Arbor Cemetery in 1879 were from a shipwreck in November of 1879. And you know what Lake Michigan is like if you've lived here. In November, and you know, the Edmund Fitzgerald, you know, we know about that up in Lake Superior. The Great Lakes are treacherous at times. So the ship's name was the Phelps, and it was what they called a canaler from Oswego, New York. So at that time, a lot of people arrived in this area, coming down the Erie Canal, coming through, and then the canal boats would come up through into the Great Lakes. And these boats were not built for the Great Lakes. They were built for a canal. So it was later determined that these boats were unfit for the Great Lakes. The account of its loss, just 60 yards away from shore, that we have found in newspaper articles is just harrowing. There were 3, it was just pummeled. It kept bottoming out because the troughs between the waves were so low that it would bottom out 60 yards out. And they tried to, people from Glen Arbor tried in a lifeboat to get out to them. And you can imagine with the tossing and turning, it took them 3 times to get out there. And there were more lives lost than these 2. But these 2 are the ones that made it to our cemetery, which was not a cemetery at the time. So the bodies were laid to rest in land that would become the cemetery. So we're closer up now. In 1880, the land where they were buried, and this was land that had belonged to a doctor there. He was not a practicing doctor in Glen Arbor. He was a property owner, and he's the one that started the cranberry bog that you drive on M22 as you're approaching Glen Arbor on the east side of the road. There's a bog area, and he created a cranberry bog there. But he owned all of this land, and M22 was not there at the time. So the 1 acre lot was sold to the township of Glen Arbor by him for the price of $1. And if you look, see where it says Glen Arbor, then below that it says H. Walker, that was his name, Dr. Walker. And then down below that, and it says 160, and right next to it is that little dark square with CEM. That's the cemetery. So at the time, a road ran west of where M22 is now. And when you're going into Glen Arbor, it bordered the eastern side of the cemetery. So the cemetery wasn't in the middle of the woods. It was alongside a road. And then the road connected back to M22. So here they are, Dr. and Mrs. Walker. They don't look too happy. Dr. Walker, he dug a drainage ditch for his cranberry bog that ran from Glen Lake and then down to the bog and then emptied out in Lake Michigan. Glen Lake is higher than Lake Michigan. And it ran right alongside the cemetery to Lake Michigan, and the ditch is still there. There are 4 Civil War veterans that we know of that are buried here at Glen Arbor through our historical research, looking at death records and obituaries and newspaper articles, even though all of those, none of those are without mistakes, as you all know. Same thing for any documentation, but we found that there are 4 that are buried there. 3 have military headstones. Without a map, we aren't sure where the 4th one is, but there is an account that says that he was buried inside a plot. We believe this year that John Sawyer, who is, I don't know if you know John, with the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, he had located information that said where his GAR marker was. And so he placed a flag there. So now we think we might know where the 4th one is. One grave with a name that might be familiar to some is that of Nels Olson. Now he's a great grandfather of one of our current residents. So this is a view of the Olson grave after the storm of 2015. We did find a way to get in, but this is part of what we were dealing with. You can see what's really fascinating is that when the storm of 2015 occurred, only 1 headstone was damaged. The rest of them had horizontal trees coming down horizontally over the graves or next to the graves, but only 1 was damaged. We have learned through recent research that Nels Olson's mother and father-in-law are also buried here. They're unmarked, most probably his mother-in-law's father as well. Again, we don't know where or which ones those graves are. Back over 100 years ago, many people were buried with a headstone and a footstone, as you can see here. And again, it's amazing that none of the stones were touched by that storm except for 1, which we have repaired. Very bad resolution picture, but there are stone gates out on M22, and this was the entrance, the old entrance to the cemetery when it was the road that went in, and then later on just became a path to the cemetery. So there are stone gates on M22. There's in Glen Arbor, there are 7 sets of stone gates that surround Alligator Hill, and this is one of them as you come into Glen Arbor on the left. And that is the entrance now to Forest Haven Road, which was put in 1962. But at that time, it was the continuation of the road north to the lake. If you died in Glen Arbor between 1879 and 1927, you might have been buried at this cemetery. The only church cemetery is at St. Philip's and Empire. There are a few small family cemeteries. Some were buried at Empire's Maple Grove Cemetery on M109, where M109 and M22 come together, just north of that. Port Oneida's two cemeteries were considered a different township. So unless you were buried on your farm, or, the body was moved to another place, like some people were buried in Traverse City here. If you died in Glen Arbor, you were usually going to be buried at the cemetery. So you're looking at a map of the Forest Haven subdivision created in 1962 by developer Pierce Stocking, who had acquired the land in a 1950 deal from the estate of D.H. Day's wife. The cemetery here denoted as Outlot A, which was designated as not to be built on, was supposed to be left out of any sales of any surrounding land, but it was not. By mistake, that detail fell through the cracks and became a part of this 1950 deal. So in 1977, the National Park Service obtained the land surrounding the cemetery, which was mistakenly included in the 1950 land deal. Up until that time, the cemetery had been excluded. Meanwhile, the township of Glen Arbor minutes show the township caring for the cemetery. And in 1968, they began looking into having it become an active cemetery. Leonard Thorson is still living. He was the caretaker at the time. For some reason, they let go of the plans, and I did find in a search of the Glen Arbor Township minutes that without a map, nobody knew where the map was, where the records were for the cemetery. In fact, they put a little article in the Leland Enterprising asking if anybody knew where the records were. I mean, it's just so haphazard. I'm laughing, but it's terrible. It's sad. It's just ridiculous. And nobody knew where the records were. And the state of Michigan said, without records, you can't reactivate, because, how would you know, right, where people are? That last part is my assumption, because how would you know where people are? But they had said, no, you have to have a map to be able to reactivate, which makes sense. When the park secured the property from the Stocking estate, the park documents say there were bodies buried there. We looked back into the documents, and it just said that they knew that there were some bodies buried there. That was it. Nothing about it being a township cemetery. So at that time, 1977, the question is, why didn't Glen Arbor say something, right? How did it? So the land is in 1968, it's still the Glen Arbor Cemetery. They want to reactivate. They learned that they can't. In 1970 or so, the park is coming in. By 1977, that's when the deed switches. But Leonard Thorson said recently that he always thought the cemetery belonged to Glen Arbor. So there are some people that weren't even aware that the cemetery was included in the deal, because of course it wasn't supposed to be. So just major confusion. Here we are, back before the storm of 2015, but this is after the park had taken it over. The picture on the left shows a headstone and an unaligned footstone in the distance. We think it's a footstone. It looks like one. The headstone to that distant grave then would be missing. And of course, we don't know whose footstone it is. The picture on the right shows the cemetery before the storm. And now we're looking from the west. So our back is to the west, where the sand dunes are behind, way a couple miles back. Forest Haven Road would be far behind you. We're looking at the back of a fenced-in area. To the right are two headstones for infants in the Levance family. The Levance family was quite an active family. As we're looking up the Levance family in the newspaper, there's a lot. They were prominent in Glen Arbor. Infant mortality, of course, was a fact back then. Of the 51 we knew at before the most recent developments that were buried there, 1/3 were age 2 or younger when they passed. 1/3 of the 51 that we knew. So, of course, people were born and died in their homes. You all know that. Rarely in a hospital. Which brings us to the storm. Afterwards, the forest was impenetrable. So the cemetery was no longer accessible. In 2017, while I was interviewing Deputy Superintendent Tom Ulrich for an article I was writing for the Glen Arbor Sun, I asked him, it's 2 years since the storm. I waited that first year. I thought, no, they are clearing paths and that trails, and they still have trees coming down, and it's too soon. 2 years later, it wasn't too soon. It was time to say, what are your plans? And he said that their hands were still full, and it's on the list, but down there. So basically the gist of the conversation that it would take a squeaky wheel to get things moving. And I knew who that had to be. It doesn't hurt. There are ways, and what one person can do, and I'm not saying this for myself now because there are a whole lot of people involved in this project now. And I'm going to step down at the end of the year, and they know that, because this project has legs. But at the beginning, if it keeps bugging you, then there's something probably that you can do. Right? So it took a while to learn the ropes. But by May of 2019, this is Susan Pocklington, who chairs the Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear organization. They are located on M22 as you're leaving Glen Arbor towards Port Oneida, that beautiful Olson farm, that's their office. And they do a lot of work partnering. In fact, basically what they do is partnering with the national park, and they're a nonprofit. So Susan, so this is national park property, right? That's what we all thought. That's what I thought. That's what I have been told. That's what the park thinks. They have the deed. And Susan partners with the park. And so I had been working with her at the suggestion of the national park to work with them. And so Susan, and then in front of Susan, you can see just disappearing into the greenery there is Dan Ostrowski, and he is the park person who was in charge of trails and paths and roads for the national park. So he's kind of a muckety muck, really. And so we clawed our way into the downed wood from a fire break that had been created after the storm. There were houses that abutted all of this national park property. There were houses there on Forest Haven Road. And the concern was, with all this down timber, a fire. So they created a fire break from which they could fight the fire, right? You need to have something so that you can get your equipment in there. So this was along the northern edge of the cemetery. And so we walked in the fire break, and then we took a right because we knew the cemetery was just over there, and you could see myrtle on the ground. It's always a telltale. Even though it's invasive, it tells us we're getting close. So we had found another way from M22, but it was not viable for what we were hoping, which was to re-access the little cemetery. So, so this became our new entrance, but at this time we actually had to climb. All the trees were down sideways, the way that one picture showed you, and we had to climb through, like get on top of, but underneath, and climb that way through the trees. It was amazing. So skipping over to our military headstones for a second, I'll continue that story in a minute. If you were in the military, and this is, I'm sure all of you know this, that the government will furnish a military headstone. So John Sawyer is the one who came in once we were able to get in here to these, and look how he cleaned up this one stone from the same stone from the left to the right. He did this, he had this contraption. The park wouldn't let us bring in anything on wheels. So he had this contraption that he brought in, which consisted of a pulley and chains, and he was able to winch it up. He went down under and got the chain under there, and he winched it up and he reset the stone. It was just amazing. And we have a Facebook group called Resurrecting the Glen Arbor Cemetery. And I have, in that Facebook group, there's a video clip of him showing him doing the work in action. So this particular marker is for Ruel Welch, who served with General Grant at the Battle of Vicksburg, which John found out for us. He was wounded and sent home after the battle. We don't have details, though, on how he was wounded. In the middle of the cemetery is a small fenced family plot for the Trumbull family, for whom Trumbull Road was named. If you go around the backside of Big Glen Lake, you come to a cute little motel, and just past it is Trumbull Road, and it cuts through, and a lot of us use it to cut through to come to Traverse City. The Trumbull Road homestead farmhouse stands at the top of the hill on the east side of the road. I didn't know any of this before we started doing this work. I didn't know that was a family plot. I didn't know why there was a fence around there. I didn't know why Nels Olson's grave was way over there. Was he an outcast? You know, I didn't know. Your mind goes, wondering about these things. Harriet and John Trumbull are among those buried inside the fenced area. This is an original Trumbull headstone. The words crudely carved in cement with a knife or a stick. So this is what the family brought later, but there's one on the left side and one on the right side for each of them. We believe Harriet is misspelled. It's supposed to be an A, not an E. So here's the thing with these flat headstones. Every year they're covered over with moss and leaves, and you can't see these. So one of the projects that we have ahead of us is to go in and lift those up and put some kind of foundation under them so that they will be up above and something that won't crumble, over time. So it'll be interesting. So we uncover it carefully each spring, along with the other one for the spouse on the other side. So this is a Trumbull plot just after the storm. Isn't that amazing? Look how the trees just graze things. Quite a miracle. And this is looking from inside the Trumbull fenced area. On the other side of those trees, that's where the Nels Olson grave was that I showed you before. Those are the same trees. But we couldn't get back any further. I mean, if you look at that, it is hemmed in. So this is the same area. The Trumbull plot being cleared on November 23rd of 2019. There are hardly any trees there now, but they will come back. The company, Partial Tree Care Experts, owned by the Partial family, some of whose children go to Glen Lake School, donated their time. I happened to be driving on, I just passed a cemetery where I saw tree people working, and I thought, well, we're talking with the national park about maybe getting in there and getting that access cleared, and I wonder if they'd be interested in doing this work. And so I stopped my car, got out of my car right there, talked to the guy that was in charge, And we made an appointment. I took him to the cemetery by the long route that wasn't really viable for us to use. And he said, you know, I would like to donate my time. He said, I think a few of the others would too. And there ended up to be 10 of them, and took them half a day, and look at what they're doing. And we couldn't have anything on wheels. So they had to take all of these tree trunk chunks out in hammocks, you know, where one would hold one side and one would hold the other side. It was an amazing. They had one person cutting and all of the rest of them carrying. Oh, let's see. Oh, wrong way. There we go. So this is still the Trumbull. Oh boy, which one did I lose track? There should be a number. I'm not sure which one I'm on, but here they are still clearing. There are hardly any trees there now. Okay. Oh, here we go. So remember in 2019 when Susan Pocklington of Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear joined me. So this is Corey Partial on the right, clearing that entrance. That was the same entrance that we were going through, all those leaves and climbing the trees. Those are the trees, down trees there that we climbed through in November 2019, under the auspices of the national park still. None of us knew at that time that it didn't belong to the national park. So this is the entrance last on May 18th, 2023. Same entrance. So if you can imagine the trees that are cut down on either side, that's national park property. They've granted us an easement. We've got a legal easement now, but all those trees, that's what was across that entrance. This is after, and then after Deering's came in twice to clear trees and then to make the ground ready so that we could do ground penetrating radar. This is the view standing on the edge of the cemetery property. In May, a month ago, 2 men from WorkSmart Inc., located in Paw Paw, Michigan, brought their ground penetrating radar and located 84 of 88 graves total, 75 new unmarked graves, 75, plus a large mass grave, which is probably a potter's field. That's what was here. And so you see these flags. Those flags are, we had a surveyor who donated his time, and he surveyed everything with them as they were doing the work. There's a larger view. Remember, except for where the stones are, this was all woods, and then it was all down woods. It was impenetrable. Note the flags way in the distance. Those pink flags denote the 4 corners of each excavation. The yellow flags mark the center on the west side of each grave where we might place a headstone in the future. Something to mark those graves. Looking from the boundary on the west with our back to Forest Haven Drive, the pink paint mark on the ground marks the outline of each excavation. By the time they were finished, this cemetery was covered in pink. And you see the existing headstones in the distance. They were just the tip of the iceberg.
What percentage of the unmarked graves that you found relate to people that still live in the area? Very many or very?
We have some, there is some Trumbull family that lives here in Traverse and they've come out. There's the Olson family. We have been contacted by people whose families are there. The Ray family they would like to see everything exhumed and everybody identified. No, that's not going to happen. Sorry, no. we're going through that right now with this Castle Mission project, and it's
Wondered if some of the families could be.
so we have a lot to talk about now. This just happened a month ago, and we're assessing the situation to see. It's very possible that we might do a fundraiser and then have a plaque where people who donated, you know, something like when you buy a brick, you know, your name goes on it, but this would be, you know, not their name going on the headstones, but maybe something. Okay. So in the Trumbull Cemetery, we had stones for 5 or 6 people, and they found 12. They found 12. 2 of them were infants, and they found, this is looking into the Trumbull plot. We saw 4 marked graves with room for 6, probably. They found 12, including 2 babies and 1 adult buried below 2 others. Contact with one of the Trumbull descendants confirmed the 1 or 2 infants, and several other names. And interestingly, James Lawrence Green, our Civil War veteran, that we didn't know where he was buried. He's in there. He was a friend of the family somehow. And we eulogized him this year. Every year now we have a ceremony. I'll tell you about that. So until now, we thought he was at large somewhere in the cemetery. So here's the ground around. Remember Nels Olson's grave with all those trees down? Those are those trees on the left to the east of him, but these are all graves, and a lot of these grave areas are contiguous, so they share a side. There's no place to walk between them, but they're also large excavations, and we don't know if there's more than one in some of them. Anyway, Nels Olson has a lot of company. He wasn't out there all by himself, you know, cast away. Back in 2020, we held the first annual memorial ceremony at the cemetery. Now that we could get in. Now, if you look in 2020, this is just after Partial did that initial clearing. So there's still a lot of tree work to be done. So this is still under the auspices of the national park, but by that time, historian Andrew White, are any of you, do you know Andrew White? He lives here in Traverse City, close to Oriana, and he is quite the historian. So he has written some books with, oh gosh, now I'm forgetting his name, about Port Oneida, and he's really something. And he's also on the board for the Leelanau Historical Museum. And I was hoping he'd be here today. He and myself had taken documentation that he discovered going back into Dr. Walker's papers, proving that Glen Arbor still owned the cemetery. He took that to he found the original deed and took all of the documentation, and he traced the trail up through those transactions where the cemetery was supposed to be excluded. And he took it, first we said, okay, well, this is really an awful project. Do we even think Glen Arbor is going to want it? But Glen Arbor wanted it. We took it to Glen Arbor first and met with some people on their board. And then with them, we made an appointment with the national park, and all the bigwigs were there. There were a lot of national park people there. And Andrew gave them the documentation and explained it succinctly, and they agreed. And they sent it to Omaha, to the attorneys in Omaha, where the center for the national parks, and they agreed. And everybody said, you know, everything always takes a long time with government. Everything takes a long time with the national park. Everything by May, this is a couple of months later, a year from when Susan Pocklington and Dan Ostrowski and I were going into that mess, the national park said, you're right. Basically, you can have it. And, but we had to have, you know, the legal papers drawn up and everything. So the legal turnover, they also said would take a long time. By late summer, it was done. And meanwhile, a Trumbull descendant, who you see her back here, she came to the 2020 ceremony, and we dedicated that cemetery, that ceremony. I've said cemetery ceremony so many times, I get it all mixed up. But that's John Sawyer there, dedicating and giving a eulogy to Edmund Trumbull, who is her ancestor, and presented the flag to her, and she placed that flag on his grave. But this was the pandemic. And even though it was outside, only 10 individuals were allowed to attend, including that TV crew, 10 of us. So as all of this developed, it occurred to me that Glen Lake School, where I had been subbing up until the pandemic, at that time could become involved. And I remember sitting in a meeting of historical writers, because I was working on that book about the Castle Mission about my dad. I thought, you know, the cemetery and everything was starting to be in the works with the national park, and we were developing projects. And I thought, I wonder if the kids at Glen Lake could be involved in helping us research or doing something like an adopt a grave or adopt a person or something like that. So it happened. The school embraced the project, and the national park loved it because they want to become involved with the schools and the community and all. So everybody, it checked a lot of boxes for the organizations. So the 8th grade class under history department chairman Melissa Okerlund took on the project of choosing from the list of those whom Andrew White had found by that time to be buried there. In several months, he had discovered this is a pandemic, so we're all stuck at home. So he's doing it all digitally. And he found digital records of death records. He did searches of the records here at the library. And he found all kinds of stuff. And so there was a list, and we knew a little bit about each one. And the kids chose, they were grouped that year, and they chose a person to research and to write about. And then also there were some things that they were supposed to find out about what life was like back then. What would these people have had to face in their lives? So making it much more real than just a story, right? So these two boys chose Civil War veteran Edmund Trumbull, whose farm had been on Trumbull Road, now owned by none other than basketball coaching legend Don Miller and his wife. It just occurred to Melissa Okerlund, oh, Don Miller owns that home. And I said, oh, even though it was a pandemic, I wonder if we could get the boys to be able to go over there. So here we are. They can't go inside because of the pandemic, but that's the Trumbull descendant there, who had been honored at the ceremony. And so they came out. And the boys are standing on the ruins of the old barn foundation. And one of the boys remarked that this house of this veteran he had been researching lay just over the hill from his house on Miller Hill. So it brought it all literally home. August 2021, the cemetery was deeded back to Glen Arbor Township, the trustees of which are advised by a cemetery advisory board, which I currently chair. In March of 2022, Deering's Tree Service came in, cleared the bulk of the remaining downed trees at an extremely low price. The owners said they wanted to give back to the community as a thank you for all the tree work since 2015. They left all the trees standing that were 6 inches in diameter or more. And, you know, we're all tree lovers. We love our forests. But at this time, and we're not talking about down trees, we're talking now about finding where all these people that we're finding documentation for, we're talking about finding where their graves are. And trees are important, but we need to honor where these graves are. And we felt that that was a priority. and that, you know, it's easy to throw away the statement that the trees will come back, but that had to be our attitude at the time. So that's the footstone for the Olson grave there, by the way. So let's look again at the trees that have grown up around the cemetery over the past century before the storm hit. They're not very big around. That means that they probably weren't there 100 years ago when the cemetery was still in use, because it was logging country, right? So probably the trees that we took down weren't historical trees anyway. That's what we like to tell ourselves, at least, you know. So when we started out, we were pretty sure there were a lot more bodies than markers here. Andy White began finding the documentation in newspapers and death records. So if you think about it, this was a township cemetery for 48 years. If just one person passed away each year, that would be 48 graves buried there. With the mortality rate, there's going to be a whole lot more. And with the medicine the way it was, and lack of antibiotics, and we knew at the time of at least 51. So here's the reason for removing all the saplings. Once the ground was smoothed out, it was possible to bring in that ground penetrating radar. So the machine rolls over the ground and can often determine whether someone is buried there or not. In January of this year, Deerings did come out again, mulching and smoothing everything in preparation for the next step. Again, at an exceptionally low price. Now remember what it looked like before with all those trees? These are some of the people who lived and worked here at Glen Arbor at one of the mills in the area. One mill was run by Frank Fisher on the Crystal River up by Fisher Road and 675 near Crystal Harbor Marina. He made shake shingles out of wood for roofs and sidings for your house. When a worker died, he told Leonard Thorson that he had found he would have the worker buried at the township cemetery, carve his name and date into a wood shingle and stick it in the ground. No wonder they became unmarked. And if you think about that, and wooden crosses, so those shingles rotted away. Another was this mill, where Glencraft is now on Glen Lake at the end of Lake Street. That's a street that Arts is on and Cherry Republic. If you go to one end, it's Lake Michigan. If you go to the other, it's Glen Lake. So right there was a sawmill owned by the Nesson, Mr. Nesson. It was called the Glen Arbor Lumber. Had about 100 employees. The folks in this picture were actually working at the mill itself. The rest were cutting and hauling lumber in the woods and working the horse teams. And a lot of those people ended up in accidents, lumbering accidents at the cemetery. And this is what it's about. The future, tied to the past. It's what you do. Tied to the past, learning about it, learning from it. Glen Lake 8th graders are becoming more involved. In addition to researching their chosen person, they've gone on a field trip to local museums. Here they're sitting in the old schoolhouse at the Empire Area Historical Museum. This is what cemeteries can be about. Any of these cemeteries, it doesn't have to have this crazy, fantastical story that we have. Any of these cemeteries can be learning experiences for the community, for every single one of your communities. They were taken on an around the block walking tour in the heart of Glen Arbor with maps to fill out. That's me in the green jacket there with my tromping boots on. So they had maps and things to fill out. They had things to do. They had an assignment. They were just not just on a tour. That's our walking tour, and they have their papers. There they are, looking at the house on the right, which was the house of John Hillman, we found out. It's a sad story. They visited the cemetery, of course. One of the sites we visited was the Fisher Homestead across from Crystal Harbor Marina. The students were sent to find where the house might have stood, to find John Fisher's headstone, and to find John Fisher's original headstone at the top of the ridge. It's accompanied by 4 empty graves. When they exhumed those graves in the 1930s, moved them to from the homestead to the Empire Cemetery, they didn't fill the holes in. So the holes are there. And what a fun project for 8th graders to go find those graves, those holes. They were also sent to find the shovel tree. Do you know, any of you know about the shovel tree? Do you know about the shovel tree? It's also on that site. So you can see the shovel in the picture on the right. But somebody left a shovel there and the tree is enveloping it. A lot of that shovel has disappeared since I became aware of it 10 or 15 years ago. So chances are it's a lot more recent than when the Fisher family lived there, but kind of fun. By the end of May last year, it was still cold, but the leaves were green and the kids wore shorts as they raised their hands when I asked the Glen Lakers to identify themselves to the rest of the crowd. They raised their hands high. Yes, they did. As Mrs. Okerlund read each name of a person buried there, the students who had chosen that person to research raised their hands again. They were attentive, respectful as they listened to the story of Daniel Parker last year, to the poetry of Anne Marie Ullman, to taps played masterfully by Norm Wheeler. Our presenters with John Sawyer and representatives from the Sons of Union veterans of the Civil War. Our historians plus yours truly from left to right, Andrew White, Len Obermeyer, Leonard Thorson, who was our guest of honor, who had been that caretaker so long ago, Barbara Sipker, missing our Mary and John Triss, who have worked extensively on Glen Arbor history. They're writing a book with Andy White and Barb Sipker. Plans are for a book on the history of Glen Arbor up to 1920. Also missing was John Pepler, the township trustee, who championed the cemetery project. He was ill from a tick bite and he passed on later that summer. So, and here we end it without John and the historians pictured, without Len Obermeyer writing a book, without Barbara Sipker connecting me with Andrew White, who turned everything upside down when he said to me in November 2018, Linda, I don't think the park owns a cemetery. I really thought he had lost it. What? The future holds much for this spot of land: grave marking, landscaping, paths, benches, ceremonies, tours, history, and maybe even a little, maybe a living history someday where we can actually have actors there being some of the people and talking about their lives in period dress. Who knows? I can't wait to see it. So here's the thing. We have that 4th of that annual memorial ceremony. The Friday, now we've had 4, honoring a different Civil War veteran, and we came to our 4th one, but there were only 10 people at the first one, so we'll probably do him again next year. It's the Friday of Memorial Day weekend at 10 o'clock in the morning. You're all welcome to be there. It's a 100-yard walk-in, but we do get the track chair. We reserve it from Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear. If your organization would like a little tour in the meantime, I'm available. I live a mile away. We walked from my home today to and from the cemetery. I would love to take you there. Thank you for listening to the story. Now, are there any questions? No, it kind of answers it. Yes, sir.
Well, hold on one second, though.
Each town.
I'm sorry. Can you say it in the
Pardon me?
microphone? You have to say it in the microphone.
Yeah.
Hear it. You have to.
You mentioned the state requires each township to maintain a cemetery.
There was a law passed in 1880.
Glen Arbor Township apparently decertified their cemetery in 1927.
The deactivated.
Yeah,
They deactivated the cemetery in 1927. Look to reactivate it again in the 1960s.
didn't they get in trouble in 1927 when they deactivated their cemetery?
Cemeteries are deactivated all the time.
So the township was not required to.
So then what the township did was they went into an agreement, a legal agreement with Empire. And so now Empire and Glen Arbor share the tax load for taking care of the Maple Grove Cemetery. But that's a really good point. Yeah, good question. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Being around the cemetery?
If you
You
could
know,
repeat that for the people on Zoom. to
yeah,
hear.
go ahead and ask the question again.
Will there be additional graves put into the cemetery?
If you were to go there with us, there's not much space left. I'm not sure how the state of Michigan would, now that we've had ground penetrating radar. So we do know where, oh, I wanted to show you something. I have to switch windows. So this is what they found with the ground penetrating radar. The little area down with the dots on the left side are the I believe those are the marked graves, and the rest of them are the areas that they found. And you see the big one. That's the mass grave. So I did want you to see that, and it's all been surveyed now. We have it on GPS in case some of the pin flags that we have marking it are, are damaged and they're already deteriorating. So we have to move quickly. If Glen Arbor were interested in doing that, and I don't think they are, it would be a state certification process again. But now we have new evidence of where there are not graves. The thing is, when you go there, you can see why Glen Arbor did what they did. Maple Grove Cemetery is much larger, and this cemetery was filling up fast. So I haven't heard any interest in that, although if they were to do that, I'd like to be the first. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Has the boundary of the cemetery been marked in any way?
Yeah, right now we have survey flags, but it's also GPS marked. So, and all of that had to be done before the property could be transferred. So there's legal descriptions and all of that. Anybody else? All right, thank you very much. I'm gonna log out of this. There I am up there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yes. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone that took the time to fill out the survey. If you didn't get one, I have additional in the back. And I want to invite everyone to join us July 27th, our next program. Derek Blount will talk about Scots-Irish research. And I'm going to introduce John Moody to talk about the GTAGS webpage.
So you just heard a very interesting and exciting, well-documented presentation. So now you're going to pay the price. How many of you know there is a website? And how many of you been to the website? Yeah, so a mix. Okay, well, the first thing I got to do is get this thing moved over to, and I wonder where you go to this thing, maybe. Well, that's a start. You know where you're going? It's not a Mac, so I don't know how to drive this. I gotta, my drive's in over there. Okay, yeah, now I can start recognizing stuff. That one right there. Nope, the one below it, the actual file. There you go. Perfect. Yeah. We'll do view. And we will do well. Yeah, it's different on this one than it was in the last. So we want to do, I guess. Slide master handout. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, is it down below? Oh, well, it could be that. It could be also down here. Yeah, see, Macs are easier. All right. So we're going to talk about the website and let me go to this. I think that's going to take it over. Excellent. Okay. Basically our site, gtags.org, that's where you end up going, was created some year. I don't know the answer. Does anybody in the room know the year it was created? That's a little research I'll need to do. With funding from Jay and Margaret Player, who are referenced on the website. And for those of you who've been around a while, obviously have some history with them. The purpose of the site is to provide organizational information, like where are the meetings, what are the meeting topics going to be, as well as research tips and links and that sort of thing to help with genealogical work. There is also archived information, newsletters and presentations like the one we just saw. Hopefully will be out there. And those two are only available to members. Others can see the rest. Non-members can log in and see that other information. GTAGS uses a service called EasyNet Sites, or a supplier called EasyNet Sites, who basically develops member-based websites for people to use. And it's for those of us who aren't programmers, it makes it much easier to just be able to go in and enter in data, and they've already filled out the form. So what you see, and in many cases is fairly fixed and not something that we can necessarily adjust. We pay, I understood the last time we paid them, every year we pay them. Last year it was $213. So it's not a bad deal. And the site generates roughly some number of visits monthly. And one of my goals is to figure out what that is. All right, so let's say you want to get on the site. What do? Well, you go into your browser and you type in gtags.org, and in some way, shape, or form, however your computer works, you should eventually be able to pull something up. You'll see down below in here. Do you see? No, you don't see that. That's too bad. Down in, I will have to do the. Hopefully, this is it. He said that would work. Oh, look at that. You'll get some sort of a field that'll say what it is. That will take you, when you get into it, you will see a page. This is most of the opening page. You see, it's called home in a different color here. So this is the home. These tabs is what I call them, represent the major organizational structure of the site. And so depending on what you want to do, and they're all pretty, in my mind, pretty self-explanatory, but I've been working with them for a little while now. So let me know if anything isn't crystal clear as to what they mean. But that's basically, you get in, you're going to always see this on the left side of the page, and be able to pick what you want to get to from there. So let's go to, since these are all members, we're going to go to members next. And come on, mouse. Where did the mouse go? Maybe I just do this. Look at that. Okay, so we've now clicked members, and this is where you log in. Now, when you joined, at least when I joined, which is not all that long ago, this was all in place. And so I received or created a login name and a password. So hopefully you all have a login name and password. And if you don't, we'll come to something later where you can probably get in and send a note to those of us who might be able to figure out how to get you one. I don't know, Sue, it was, for me, it was involved in the signing up process. How would somebody maybe?
But I put everybody, members are added onto the website by me as a membership chair, and I assign your login name and your password as your original, and then every member then goes in and modifies that login name and member password to suit themselves.
Right. So that will be roughly the process. If you don't have one or don't remember what it is, we'll follow a process like that, I think, going forward.
Anybody who has lost that information, contact me and I'll reset.
Okay. So when you've logged in successfully, you will be presented with more information than the non-member will. And we hinted at that earlier, but you'll see there are meeting presentations. There's a membership list, so everybody who's in is listed there. Newsletter archive, you can also get at your profile, and then something called forums. And let's skip ahead. So I decided I'd show you what the page looks like for profile. In profile, you would click profile, you could click member info, you could click any of these other headings here. But in this case, I clicked contact info to show you, okay, well, let's look at contact info and how you would do this. This happens to be me. Let's say I moved and I wanted to put a new address in. I would click the little pencil and that would let me do the editing. So very straightforward, very easy to do. Okay. That's interesting. It was almost off the screen. All right. So here is forum. So this was a recent request from Rita at the time. And I think this could be very powerful. Forums, I don't know, how many of you have used forums on the internet? There's forums everywhere. Your car has a forum, believe it or not. There'll be people out there who created a Chevy Blazer forum. And you can go there and find all kinds of great ways to fix your car. So forums are places where, like I said, it's a topic and it has a moderator, and you go there and you enter in, you'll see it's dedicated, they're dedicated topics that added pretty much like on request, but they're major themes. And then within those major themes, anybody can go in there and start a specific topic about that theme. So for instance, now Rita had stuck one in here about the Perry Hanna families. Anybody know anybody who's, or is anybody doing genealogy on Perry Hanna? Nobody's responded to this, unfortunately, but let's say one of you had done research on Perry Hanna. You could have gone in and seen this, and you could write a response to this and say, yes, I've done this, and here's what I found. And pretty soon you might have other people joining, and you'd be starting to share what you've learned, and you can see that it becomes an opportunity to take what we do separately and what we've learned in these meetings and go off and work, easily online and explore the topics of whatever you're interested in. And so I encourage you all to get into the site and look into these forums and think about, if you've got topics that you're interested in, that you would like to get some help or see what other people know, go ahead and do it. Like I said, you can fix your Chevrolet forum, so you can certainly find an ancestor on a forum. Okay, with that, the last slide I think here is the if you have problems and you need help, or the password situation or whatever, there's a contact page, and you can send an email if you prefer to go into your email system, and you can send it to info@gtags.org, or you can use a web contact form, which will send it to the same place. And as a hint, that's Anna, who's listening in on the call, but Anna would see those. The only other connection here is Webmaster, that's me. So if you send it to Webmaster, I'll see it. And that's it. So any questions about the website that I can try to answer? Told you it wouldn't be as exciting as the last one. Okay, well, where's there? Ah, there she is. Madam President, I guess you're back. All right. I will get out of this thing.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.